Greetings and welcome. To begin, we acknowledge that the CSU Monterey Bay campus sits on the unceded territory of the Rumsen Ohlone people. I'm Professor Umi Vaughn, Faculty Director of the Center for Black Student Success at CSUMB. The center engages and is a home to African diaspora students. Our goal is to make their experience here more positive and facilitate higher and higher graduation and satisfaction rates. Welcome to Spring 2021. Welcome to Black History Month, February 2021. We understand, of course, that Black history is American history, is world history, and to be celebrated year-round. Today is just another occasion to highlight Black culture and contributions. The presentation that we have set up for you tonight sits between two of the signature programming series that we offer. One is the Madam C.J. Walker, Robert F. Smith Black Professional Series, and the other is the Daniel Hill Williams Black Health Education Series. The presentation we have tonight is going to dip and dab and share in ways that fit both of those series. Audience members are welcome to share their questions through the chat on YouTube. And for those of you who are cooking along with us, please be careful and know that the university isn't liable for any mistakes you might make. I'm very, very excited to bring our first guest for this new year, a friend of mine, author, chef, all-around great person, Mr. Bryant Terry. Let's welcome him.
All right. Thank you, Professor Vaughn. I'd like to also thank you, Ms. Pena, for all her the help getting tech situated. As we know, that is important that we have all that arranged before these type of events. And I want to congratulate the university community on this momentous occasion. I definitely know the value of these type of centers, and I think it's important that these spaces, academic spaces and otherwise, create support systems for all people of color, but specifically African Americans, given many of the historical ways in which our communities have been marginalized, specifically within educational institutions. So I am here to make some food, but I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about myself before I start cooking. And I know that stressful moments like this historical moment that we're in oftentimes require a bit of levity. And I think that cooking has always been such a powerful way to talk about important issues, but to do them to package them in a way that I think we can all relate to, because we all eat, right? It's something that we all share. And my goal is to help invite us to reimagine the ways that we connect with food and culture and community and all the important issues that I've been working on for 2 decades. So I think it's important for me to recognize that all the work that I'm doing is standing on the shoulders of my ancestors. And, I can start with my blood ancestors, my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, Edward Bryant and Rosalie Terry, my maternal grandparents, Andrew Johnson Terry and Margie Bryant. So many of the lessons that I'm imparting with the work that I do, I always say that I learned them in my grandparents' kitchen. I learned these lessons in my grandparents' gardens. And I am simply bringing forth the knowledge, the connection with the land, and their understanding of the importance of Black people being self-sufficient, being able to feed ourselves. My grandfather would often tell me that when you rely upon others to feed you, when they decide to stop feeding you, you'll starve. And that's one of those lessons that I've carried since childhood in thinking about, the important issues of health, food, and agriculture. So I grew up in this family with roots in rural Mississippi and Tennessee and Arkansas. In fact, we had farms in these rural areas. Unfortunately, there's this history of land being stolen from African Americans in the South. I should mention I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and also the kind of systemic way in which our own government, the USDA, has systemically taken land from African Americans throughout the 20th century. And, our family was certainly no stranger to this reality. But growing up, I had access to this rural, these farms in the rural South, as well as these thriving local food systems that my family was a part of in Memphis, where I grew up. And so, I would say the food that I grew up, I was an omnivore, and we talk about this ethos of eating locally, seasonally, and sustainably. And so often we center California, the movement that Alice Waters helped to propel in the 1970s. But I think it's important that we always recognize that these are traditions that African Americans, people of African descent, have long had. And my work is about uplifting these traditions that are so often erased, forgotten, and I think we should all remember, piece back these histories. This West African concept in the icon of Sankofa is something that guides my work in so many ways. And the idea is that when we're moving forward, we're looking backwards at the same time and bringing with us the best practices, the teachings, the knowledge of our ancestors and elders and those who came before us. So Sankofa is a thread that flows throughout my work. And, the food that we ate was as local as our backyard garden. It was always in season. And oftentimes we would literally harvest the food right before preparing it. When I travel, when we were in a space where I can actually be out in the world and traveling, I would sometimes do up to 90 events per year. And it was interesting because so often when I'm presenting, at the beginning of my talk, I ask everyone, raise your hand if you come from a family that has agrarian roots and had farms. And then, people started raising their hands. And raise your hand if your family had home gardens or, were part of community gardens in the communities that they were part of. And then you have people raising their hands. And then, how many of your families cook food from scratch and canned and pickled and preserved and all these practices that so many of us had before the industrialization of our food system. And there's been this collective amnesia where we've forgotten about many of these practices. So once again, I see my role as kind of nudging us to remember, to piece back these histories and know that the ways in which Big Mama and Papa and Nana and Mima and Granddaddy and Grandpa, those practices are ones that we should, creatively think about how we can incorporate those into our daily practices so that we can live more healthfully and sustainably and, leave this earth a better place for our children and their children. So I do want to tell you about the pivotal moment in my life where I actually was politicized around food. As I said, I grew up an omnivore and I was an athlete growing up. And so much of what I was programmed to believe is that you got to eat as much as possible, lift a lot of weights, and you got to be able to run over people. I played football. And so in high school, I did have a lot of peer pressure from my buddies on the football team because this was kind of the way that they were interacting with food. So I pretty much went overboard with a lot of fast food and processed food and packaged food, just kind of like this overindulgence of industrial foods. I think it was so important for me to go through that phase as a young person, now as an educator, as someone who works around these issues in various ways, just to understand the ways in which young people are often pressured to eat unhealthfully. I think about that kind of peer pressure, but I also think about the kind of psychic violence that so many young people are accustomed to, whether it's the, pop-up ads on their phone when they're surfing the internet, or billboards or ads or jingles. I always frame this as a form of psychic violence that's promoting the worst foods and the worst beverages. Unless you're in California, unless you're in Northern California, you probably aren't seeing billboards and ads for things like avocados and other, real foods. Across the country, this is not the case. And so, I see the work that I'm doing is kind of pushing back against these narratives that would have us believe that in order to be good Americans, good consumers, we have to consume a lot of the foods that are actually killing us. But in high school, in the 10th grade, everything changed for me. And it was actually a hip hop song that shifted my habits and my attitudes and my politics regarding food. And so that reality is one of the reasons that I think it's so important that, my work is intersectional, that my work is multimedia. And I think about the many ways in which, people learn, as the term that I'm sure you've heard, there's neurodiversity among learners, and there are different ways in which people are going to kind of assimilate what they're learning. And so some people, a heady intellectual lecture might be the perfect way for them to learn. But for other people, it might be something more tactile and practical, such as this, a cooking demonstration. It might be a song. It might be a book. So I just want all of us to understand that when we're trying to, because I think I'm really happy and excited about this sea change, this shift that we're seeing, where more people are rejecting our industrial food system, more people are embracing, if not a whole on like vegan or vegetarian diet, thinking about the ways in which we can incorporate more plants into our diet, more real food into our diet. We know studies have shown that a healthful plant-centered diet, meaning that it's replete with lots of dark leafy green vegetables, tubers, legumes, all these things that we know we should be consuming for our overall health and well-being. There are a number of peer academic studies that are saying that a plant-centered diet is the best diet for us to prevent chronic illnesses and for us to also ameliorate many of the symptoms when people do have chronic illnesses. And there are a number of organizations and research institutions that are like looking at the ways in which plant-centered diets can help reverse many chronic illnesses, and obviously ameliorate the symptoms of some of those same illnesses. So I want to be clear. I'm not here to convince anyone that you should be vegan. I can make arguments all day about the environmental, the ethical, the economic reasons why we should all be embracing a plant-based diet. But when it comes to our health, I don't think there's one perfect diet for any one of us. I don't think there's a panacea. In fact, I don't think that, what we're eating throughout our life might need to shift and change because our bodies are growing and shifting and changing. And so most important, I think we need to be eating real food. We need to be rejecting these processed and packaged industrialized foods. And we need to, just have a more kind of symbiotic relationship with the natural world. And so, but I do want to kick the lyrics to the song that changed everything for me, because it's a hip hop song that's dear to me. And I think a lot of people who didn't grow up in the era in which I grew up in the late 1990s, when there was a period where hip hop was very purposefully conscious, political, dealing with a lot of social issues. And, a lot of that music just happened to be played on the mainstream radio, and you'd see videos for it. So the song is called Beef, and it's by the group Boogie Down Productions, one of the pioneering hip hop groups in from the Bronx in New York. And their lead MC is KRS-One, knowledge reigns supreme over nearly everyone. And it goes a little something like this. Beef, what a relief. When will this poisonous product cease? This is another public service announcement. You can believe it or you can doubt it. Let us begin now with the cow, the way that it gets to your plate and how. The cow doesn't grow fast enough for man, so through his greed, he creates a faster plan. He has drugs to make the cow grow quicker. Through the stress, the cow gets sicker. 21 different drugs are pumped into the cow in one big lump. And just before it dies, it cries in the slaughterhouse full of germs and flies. I'll stop there because it gets much more graphic. But, like many people, I was under the illusion that, animals cows would be kind of running in fields, happily living, and then they just lay down and go to sleep and end up on our plates. I didn't realize the extreme violence that takes place in our industrialized food system against these other living beings, and the way that it not only impacts these animals, but also the environment and also human health as well. And so that pivotal moment for me showed me that there's so many ways that we can help everyone, but specifically young people, think differently about the way that they're living, really reimagine their relationship with food and shift their habits and attitudes in politics. And I keep mentioning politics because I think that it's important to recognize when we talk about things like, certain communities having high rates of chronic illnesses, we need to peel back the layers and move beyond these narratives about blaming the victim without understanding the complicated ways in which people relate to food. There are a number of economic and geographic and physical barriers that so many of our communities throughout the United States have to accessing healthy and fresh and affordable and culturally appropriate and safe food. And so we need to move beyond. I mean, look, yes, if food's available and people have access to healthy food, it's our responsibility to take care of ourselves. But when you think about a community like West Oakland, California, I moved from Brooklyn, New York in 2005 to the Bay Area. I was actually living in Berkeley when I first moved here, but I was connected with a lot of community groups working in Oakland. And there was a study at that time, and that study determined that in West Oakland, California, there were 53 corner stores and liquor stores and not one single supermarket. So what you have is a situation where the denizens of this community were relying upon corner stores and liquor stores to provide their food needs. Not only do these corner stores and liquor stores, are they stocked with an overabundance of processed foods, packaged foods, foods that are high in salt and sugar and low in the desirable nutrients that we all need, but specifically young people. To add insult to injury, so many of these stores, the prices are double of the prices that you might find at a supermarket in more affluent parts of Oakland or in Emeryville or in Berkeley. So I want us to understand that these issues are political. When we talk about food, we're talking about politics. I'm gonna, and I know I'm supposed to be doing some, I'm gonna get into the cooking soon, but I just want to tell you a little bit more about just kind of like my journey moving more into food activism and writing and publishing, because a lot of people have come to my work as an author of 5 books now. I'm currently working on the 6th book. Some people have heard me in the media, but what I want people to know is that my work is grounded in grassroots activism. I was living in New York City, and at the time I was a PhD student in history at NYU. And I was studying with this professor, Robin D.G. Kelly, one of our preeminent historians. And at the time, I was doing some research on radical movements in the 60s and the 70s. And a lot of my research was focused on the Bay Area, looking at the work of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And I think it's important that I say their original full name, because as many of us know, the popular media, the political establishment, they wanted to paint the Black Panther Party as just, this militant organization full of these gun-toting, radical, kind of rhetoric spewing militants who weren't really doing anything. But what people need to understand is that, first of all, I think it's important to note that the reason that the Black Panther Party for self-defense started is because of police brutality. So what we've been talking about throughout 2020, the kind of like extrajudicial killings of Black people, the violence against Black citizens, violating people's rights, killing them, like these were the same issues that the Black Panthers were seeing in West Oakland, California in the 1960s. And that is what catalyzed this movement, this group forming to address police violence. And they also understood the need to address the material conditions of people living in this region. And so they had a number of programs, all under the rubric of their survival programs. They had over 60 of them. And the survival programs were aimed at meeting the basic needs of people living in communities. The ones that moved me more than any were the ones that address food. And they sat at this brilliant intersection of poverty, malnutrition, and institutional racism in terms of what they were addressing. So they had grocery giveaways in which the Black Panthers were giving away bags of groceries to low-income residents of the Bay Area who were economically insecure. But they also had their Free Breakfast for Children program, which many of you may have heard of. The Free Breakfast for Children program was started in January 1968 with the help of a reverend in West Oakland, California. This program was aimed at simply feeding young people a hot, nourishing breakfast every single morning. Do any of you out there have a problem with feeding young people living in historically marginalized communities a hot, nourishing breakfast every single morning? Especially now that we know there's a growing body of academic research that connects nutrition with educational outcomes, behavioral outcomes. The Black Panthers were ahead of the game and ahead of the curve in so many ways. So they started this program. You know who had a problem with the program? The United States government had a big problem with this program. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI at the time, said that this program was the most dangerous threat to the internal security of the United States. So after learning about this brilliant work, I saw the world through fresh eyes. And I remember this day so specifically, clearly when I was riding the subway from my apartment in Brooklyn to Manhattan to go teach a class, 7:30 in the morning, and I look over and I see young people, children, eating Red Hot Cheetos, candy bars, drinking sodas, sugary drinks, energy drinks. This was their breakfast. And that was a moment that I decided that I wanted to, in the spirit of the Black Panthers, in the spirit of my grandparents, in the spirit of, the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad's health ministry with, his How to Eat to Live, this book series where he talked about the ways in which African Americans need to be conscious about what we're eating. I did this standing on the shoulders of Seventh-day Adventists, Black Seventh-day Adventists. The first time I ever heard about vegetarian or vegan eating was from Black Seventh-day Adventists. I do this standing on the shoulders of Dick Gregory, the comedian and social justice activist, who had his book Cooking with Mother Nature, talked about the different ways in which Black communities were being killed by what we're consuming, and really presenting these alternative models of more healthful eating. So it's important for me to say that because I think so often when we imagine healthful eating, when we imagine vegetarian and vegan eating, there's this default way in which so many of us think about these, what used to be kind of like imagining upper middle class suburbanites in the way that they would consume, but more recently, I think we imagine, urban, young gentrifiers in urban centers, right? And so part of my mission, a big part of my mission, is helping us understand that when we peel back the stereotypes, the vilification of Black food globally, but specifically with African-American cuisine, there are these ways in which the food is often reduced to a couple things. So this is what I hear people, when they talk about Black food, this is the way in which I hear them describing it. People often talk about it being slave food. Why would I eat Black food? This is the type of food that, during the period of enslavement, enslaved Africans had to rely upon the food that the plantation owners didn't want, whether it was the tops of vegetables or whatever parts of vegetables that were discarded, or the animal innards. The problem with this argument is ahistorical in that the institution of slavery wasn't a monolith. It looked different in different parts of the American South and the Caribbean, South America. And so, yes, in the Black Belt of the South, it was a more paternalistic system in which all needs of enslaved Africans were taken care of by plantation owners, people's housing, clothing, food. But it looked different in the coastal Carolinas. It looked different in Louisiana. It looked different in the Caribbean. And so we need to have a more complex understanding of the institution of slavery and understand that oftentimes many enslaved Africans might have days off. They might have their own plot of land where they can grow food for themselves and their family. They would hunt for animals at night to supplement the protein. So simply rejecting the food as slave food is erroneous. But the other thing that people often talk about and imagine Black food is as the comfort foods of the cuisine, the deep fried fatty meats, the overcooked vegetables, the sugary desserts, the hyper flavors that you find at soul food restaurants. So I'm not denying that either of these are part of the larger culinary history, but when we look at the roots, the core of not only African American cuisine, and you can't talk about Black food in America without talking about the larger diaspora and the food of the Caribbean, the food of the West and Central Africa, the food of Europe and the native foods of this continent. The core of this cuisine, we're talking about things like dark leafy greens like collards, mustards, turnips, kale, dandelion. We're talking about healthful, legumes, black-eyed peas. We're talking about sugar snap peas, pole beans. These are the type of foods that any Western trained allopathic physician or dietitian or nutritionist would say we should all be eating. So we have to move beyond this vilification of Black food and understand that specifically for people of African descent, we need to embrace this food for our own liberation. I think one of the criteria that's often missing from the way in which you talk about eating what's healthful is eating the foods that our ancestors ate. What are the foods that sustain the people that came before us? And so I would argue that getting back to the core foundational foods of traditional Black cooking is actually a key to our liberation. So let's cook. I'm actually making a dish, even though my last book, Vegetable Kingdom, was published March of last year. No, February. But my tour, my international book tour was canceled because of shelter in place. And so, but I'm actually going to make a recipe from my book, Afro Vegan, which was published in 2014. And Afro Vegan was my attempt to help us to understand and kind of imagine more of an African diasporic, culinary traditions and showing the connections. And so, I really approached this project as a collagist inspired by some of my favorite artists, visual artists like Romeo Bearden, or the collagist Deborah Reynolds in Austin, Texas, or hip hop producers like Prince Paul or Metal Fingers Doom or Madlib, who take these different elements and piece them together to create something beautiful. And that was the approach to this book. Now, this specific recipe I'm making is a tofu curry with mustard greens. And this comes from, it's inspired by a Tanzanian fish curry that I have in New York City. So before I get into the actual dish, what I want to do is I want to talk to you all a little bit about stock. Can you guys see this? You see this right here? These are the elements for making a vegetable stock. And I've become a bit of a stock evangelist, I have to say. Now, as someone who went to culinary school, for whatever reason, I had this barrier. There was some barrier around me making homemade vegetable stock, and I would often opt for box stocks. But once I started making, I was like, why did I not do this earlier? I will say this. We're at a point where you can find really good quality vegetarian and vegan box or bottled stocks, or even vegetarian and vegan bouillon cubes to help add flavor and depth to different dishes. And the reason that I'm making this fresh stock for this curry is because with plant-based cooking, you really have to be intentional about building all the layers of flavor. And so going back to like these traditional foodways in the American South and even in West and Central Africa, so often, in cultures where if you're not living in a place where meat is the only thing that's available, meat was often used, most often used as something to add nutrient density, a little bit of flavor, adding a piece of, fat back or, some type of rendered lard. Like these things were added to deepen flavor, because before the industrialization of our food system, if you were working class, working poor, you simply couldn't afford to have meat at every single meal because it was cost prohibitive. And so these are things that people would reserve for holidays and occasions and special occasions. So I'm saying that to say that there are ways in which you can use animal products to just kind of cheat a really flavorful and delicious broth or stock or soup or stew or whatever you're making. And I get that, and I'm not hating on that. But if we're talking about plant-based cooking, I think one of the primary building blocks to really delicious and flavorful food is making stocks. And I make these stocks not only for things like this curry or soups or stews, but in recipes that often call for water, we will use stock instead just to deepen the flavor. And so let me show you what we have. And the stock is really, look, literally, if you can boil a pot of water, you can make stock, because that's all it really is boiling a pot of water and then adding this melange of vegetables. So what I typically will add in my stock are carrots, and I usually just use 2-3 medium-sized carrots, because depending on what the dish is, you don't want the stock to be oversweet. You know, carrots are going to lend it with a little more sweetness. Obviously, if you're making like a carrot soup, for example, then it wouldn't really matter if you loaded your stock with carrots. But, you know, I usually just use a couple just to give it like some depth of flavor and add a little bit of sweetness. I was always taught to peel your carrots before adding them to a stock, because they will take off a little bit. It'll take off a little bit of the bitter edge if you do that. So a couple carrots, onions. I'll usually add 1 or 2 onions. You know, in terms of you can use yellow, you can use white, you can use purple onions. It really doesn't matter. And the thing is, you don't have to peel it. All you need is a good sharp knife. By the way, one of the cornerstones of a good, just like you being a proficient cook at home, is getting a good knife. You want to get a good knife and you want to keep it sharp. I was always taught that you're much more likely to cut yourself with a dull knife than a sharp knife. And so if you can, invest in a good knife. I think it's an investment for the long-term just health of your. Okay, one of my cameras is not working. We're not gonna worry about that. So onions, garlic, and as I said, you don't even have to cut the onions. You simply need to. You don't even need to peel the onions. You just need to cut them up maybe in quarters and then add them to the stock. Same thing with garlic. You can simply take the butt of your hand and then open up the garlic head. If you want to just take the individual cloves, you can just break them up and then put them in there. I often add mushrooms. The mushrooms add umami, this fifth flavor, which is kind of in between sweet and savory, but it does add more depth. I'll add a couple of potatoes, usually about 2 celery sticks, and then I often add a little bit of cabbage, bay leaves, which add a little bit of flavor. And then this depends on what you're making. But I often add these habaneros, or if I have access to them when I'm making like African or Afro-Caribbean food, Scotch bonnets. And the thing about the Scotch bonnets, you can add those to your soup, to your stew, to a stock. And what it's going to do is actually bring more flavor into whatever the dish is. Now, the key is adding it whole with the stem on. As soon as the habanero in this case opens up and the liquid can get in there with the veins and the seeds, that's when you're going to draw all the heat out, and it's probably going to be a little too hot. So use these cautiously, but they do add a lot of flavor. And this stock, so I cut in another tip. When you're cutting up your vegetables, try to cut them in uniform pieces. Imagine if you're roasting vegetables and you have some huge chunk of the carrot, and then you have this smaller one. Obviously, the smaller one's going to cook much quicker than the bigger one. By the time the bigger one is fully fork tender, then the small one is probably shriveled up and burned. So what you want to do is you want to be conscious about cutting everything in a uniform piece so that everything can kind of cook at the same time. 2 quarts of water, stock pot, turn the heat on, bring it up to a boil, lower the heat to a nice simmer, partially cover it, and let that cook for about an hour and a half, and just really draw all the flavor and the nutrients from all those vegetables. And then you simply want to strain it in a colander, pushing down all the solids, whatever you have left, compost those, and it yields this rich, flavorful stock. Now, you might be asking, well, the recipe only calls for 2 cups of stock. This is 6. What do I do with the rest? Well, fresh stock will last in your refrigerator probably 3 or 4 days. After that, it might be on the risk of turning sour. One thing that we do at home, because we probably make stock at least every 2 weeks. And what my wife and I do is we'll actually take ice cube trays. We'll wait till the stock's cool down. We'll take ice cube trays and we'll pour the stock in the trays, freeze those. And then once they're frozen, we break the cubes into these larger Ziploc bags so that then we can then take out, just enough for whatever dish we're making. So if we're going to have, I don't know, like, some quinoa, rather than using water, we'll melt the cubes, use the stock, and it's just going to have so much more flavorful. So stock taken care of, you're good to go. I do want to give you one more tip in terms of making a stock with more depth, because it depends on the season. I think it's important that we eat in season. Our industrialized food system allows us to have strawberries in the dead of winter. We can get anything at any time and probably from anywhere in the world. And it's fun, and I'm not, I'm not such a purist that I won't enjoy, foods that are out of season if they're being made for me. But the thing is, we need to be in rhythm with the earth. Mother Nature is very clear about what we need at different parts of the year. So obviously in the summer when it's hot, we're sweating a lot, we need to hydrate. The earth is producing a lot of fruits and vegetables with a lot of, water, and you have things like strawberries and tomatoes and watermelon, things that are refreshing, cooling, and hydrating. In the winter, we probably need to be eating warmer grounding things, and that's when the earth is producing, tubers and what do they call them? Root vegetables, these things that are really heavy and grounding and really help us to be sated during the colder months. So I truly believe in eating in season. But let's get to this curry. It's going to be quick. That's why I had some time to talk to you all before, because this is not that complicated of a recipe. And the thing is, let me just get started. Talking too much. All right. So the first thing is we have our firm tofu. I don't know if you can see this. That is a block. These are cubes that were cut from a larger block of tofu. Now, I might run myself out of business here, but I want to just be clear. Recipes should be used as a guide. I think the real magic of cooking comes with spontaneity and creativity and using what's on hand. And, the reason that I write plant-based recipes and write these cookbooks that are full of plant-based recipes is because I want people to at least have an option. I want people to feel like they have resources. So if they don't want to eat meat, whether it's for a day, a week, a year, or for the rest of their lives, I want people to have a resource that they know they can have flavorful, delicious, rich food that is devoid of animal products. And so that being said, if you want to add a different protein to this, rather than adding the tofu, you can certainly add some chicken. You can add fish at the last minute, which is kind of harking back to the inspiration for this dish, which is the fish curry. But I think you should give it a try with tofu. And my suggestion before making a recipe is, or I should say before modifying a recipe, is kind of making it to the letter, unless there's something in there that you can't eat because of an allergy or something like that. Make it as written, and then that'll give you a sense of the chef's kind of like vision, and then you can kind of modify from there. I do want to mention that, if you're looking here, you see that I have everything kind of neatly placed in ramekins and bowls. And this is something that I want to encourage you all to do. Now, I know it may seem a little chefy. This is called a mise en place, which is French for everything in its place. But let me tell you why I want to encourage you to do it. Putting everything in your mise en place before you start cooking actually helps you be a much more efficient cook at home, right? And so rather than getting into the recipe and you cut your tofu and then you start cooking that, and then you're like, oh, I gotta have my diced onions, and then you take the time to dice the onions, you're actually wasting a lot of time rather than reading through the recipe. And I suggest before you even think about prepping ingredients, you read all the way through the recipe just so you can get a sense of every step and where you need to be, throughout those steps. Because it may be a situation where For example, I make these cashew cream, which is raw cashews that have been blended, soaked in water overnight and blended so that they create this creamy texture that then can be used as a replacement for, heavy cream, for example. So I often use the cashew cream if I'm making grits. So you don't want to get through the recipe and then you find that, oh my gosh, I have to make this cashew cream, but the cashews need to soak overnight. So read your recipe through before going shopping, or at least before you make the dish, and then set up your mise en place. This is just going to have everything here. So all you need to be doing is throwing thing in the pan or whatever you need to do with it, and not worrying about having to go and prep when you started to actually make your dish. So with the tofu, what I do is, and this is firm tofu, and to be clear, I don't like the ways in which, historically vegetarian cooking in the United States, post 1970s, has over relied upon tofu. I prefer to use it in a way that it's often employed in Asian cooking, kind of sparingly. I can't tell you how it unnerves me when people have this kind of ethos of like, oh, we just replaced the steak with a big slab of tofu. It's kind of ridiculous, but that's a whole other story. So tofu is simply soybeans that have been blended and formed into this cake. It's a staple in a lot of East Asian and Southeast Asian cooking, and it is a great analog for the kind of texture and mouthfeel that one might get from animal products. So what I do with the tofu is I actually toss it in a little bit of olive oil, hit it with some salt. I put it in the oven on a parchment lined baking sheet at about 450 degrees and cook that for about 30 minutes, turning it about halfway in between so that there's even cooking. And what that's going to do is yield this crunchy, because you want it to cook until it's golden on the outside. So you're going to have this tofu that has this golden and crisp coating, and on the inside it's going to be creamy and soft. And so we will roast that, set that to the side, and then once we have our curry simmering, we add that, and then that tofu is going to just soak up all the delicious base for this curry, and it works really well. As I said, if you want to substitute for a different protein, go right ahead. So really quickly, the first thing, you can read the recipe at home. If you want to make this dish, you can make it. You don't really need me, but I'm more interested in kind of talking you through some fundamental skills that you can take back and take beyond this recipe and apply them to different dishes that you might be making. So one of the things that is very important to me is empowering people to make these spice blends and different things that we often are kind of given in a pre-package. Get your taco blend or get your whatever type of spice blend. This particular curry spice blend is one that I created, and I just feel like it's like mild, it's flavorful, it's a good base for people to start with. And the thing about making your own spice blends is that you can customize them to fit whatever your needs are. So you may not like a lot of ginger, so you can pull back on the ginger powder that we put in here. Maybe you want a little more heat, you can add a little more chili powder just to bump that up a notch. So I highly encourage you to make your own spice blends, and I highly encourage you to use whole spices when you can. If you see that, these are cumin seeds. And the thing about the pre-blended, there we go. So the thing about the pre-blended spice mixes that you get, because obviously you can get just pre-ground cumin, right? Most often, the pre-ground spice blends that you find in the supermarket, unless there's a lot of turnover at these particular markets, sometimes these spices are sitting there for 3 months, 6 months, maybe over a year. And what you want your spices to play a strong supporting role in the dish in bumping up the flavor. And the best way to get the most flavor from your spices is using whole ones. And then we're gonna just toast this over the heat, medium-high heat, just to start to bring out, because what toasting does is it starts to bring out the oils. It kind of awakens the spice. And so it brings out some of the oils, and then you're gonna get much more flavor from that. So we have our cumin seeds. I'm simply toasting them. You probably want to toast it for about a minute or so. When it starts to smell fragrant, that's when you know you're good to go. So we're gonna transfer this into my trusty mortar. I actually collect mortars and pestles from around the world. I think it's a beautiful symbol of the kind of similar ways in which people have engaged food throughout cultures and history. So I'm gonna simply grind up.
Bryant,
Yes.
we had another great chef, Roberto Perez, who has a company called Pilon, Urban Pilon, and he talked a lot about the pilon as a symbol for mixing and blending cultures too. We actually have our first question coming from our many followers right now.
Okay, what's up?
Since you just threw something in that pan, we have a person who's interested in knowing what kind of pan you're using.
That's a great question. And I try not to be a pitch man. I probably get like half a dozen emails a week about brand partnerships, and I'm very selective about them. But I was given this pan by Our Place, and it's a woman-owned company. They create these beautiful pans that are very functional. You can actually, we just ordered like the Chinese steamers, so you can make like bao and dim sum. You can put those over. They have a strainer. It actually has literally a spatula that comes with it. This is a great pan. I gave this to my 9-year-old who has recently been obsessed with cooking. And so she loves it, but obviously I use it as well. So what I would say is, if you're a novice cook, if you're just really starting to engage with cooking, this Our Place pan is actually a great place to start just because it's so versatile. So hope that helps.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
We'll hit you with some in just a second.
So what I'm going to do now is actually add some mustard seeds. And so the mustard seeds, you want to be careful with those because any spices will burn quickly if you're mindful of what's going on. And so you want to keep it at like medium, low, medium. Once you start getting too hot, it's going to burn up. And then once it's burned, you just got to start over. So we have these mustard seeds, which are going to go into the spice blend as well. And the thing about the mustard seeds, you'll know when they're starting to cook and they're ready to go because they're going to start popping like popcorn. So that's the way to kind of track where those are. And I'm looking, yes, I am reading my cookbook to make my recipe because I don't remember these things. I'm creating like hundreds of recipes every year. So we got we got our spice blend. Oh yeah. So what we're gonna do is I'm just gonna add everything in here because we have our mustard seeds. They're gonna start to pop soon. I'm gonna add in our cumin that we just toasted and ground in a mortar. And then we have a little bit of chili powder. Let me turn this so it won't burn. We have a little bit of ginger powder and garlic powder. Now there is one ingredient that I use in this curry, and I think it's a cornerstone of a good curry, and it's cardamom. And I actually thought that I had some more cardamom at home, but I didn't. So this one doesn't have cardamom. I think it'll be fine without it. But if you haven't seen cardamom, it's a little bit of pod that is used in a lot of Indian cooking and South Asian cooking. And you break it open and then you get the seeds out. So this is our spice blend. I'm just going to set this aside for a second. And then I'm going to add our oil. And then we're just going to saute our onions. Now, this is one onion that has been diced, medium dice. As I said, you want to have a level of uniformity whenever you're making, a dish and you're cutting a vegetable. Try to cut them as uniformly as possible. In fact, I think one of the things that will probably give you a lot of confidence in cooking, if you can access it, And there are a lot of resources. In fact, you can probably find a dozen or more videos on YouTube around basic knife skills. Once again, I know these things seem super chefy. I know many of you probably don't have any desires to work in the food world professionally, but these are these are skills that are actually going to help you be much more efficient when you're cooking. So we have our garlic, our onion simmering, I'm sauteing our onions, I'm adding our spice blend, and then I'm mixing the onions and the spice blend really well, because what you want to do is you want to use the onions and your alliums, your garlic, onions, whatever. I'm going to add some garlic, actually. I have 2 cloves of garlic that I mince. Mince is when you cut it as finely as possible. I'm adding this, and the thing is, it's a great way to help carry all the spices into your soup or stew or curry or whatever it is. The last thing you want to do is dump a lot of like brown spices in a big vat of liquid, because it's just going to get lost in there. So you see here, everything is simmering beautifully, and it's about ready to go. You know, I probably cook these 5 to 7 minutes, medium low heat, just until they're soft and starting to turn translucent. If I really want to deepen the flavor, I'll turn the heat down as low as possible and then cook these onions for about 20 to 30 minutes, caramelizing them, which is simply cooking them over low heat, stirring them frequently so they don't stick to the bottom of the pan. And what that does is it brings out the natural sugars in the onions. Don't let anyone ever serve you any caramelized onions in which sugar has been poured in. I've seen it happen before. The whole point of caramelizing onions is to bring out the natural sugar, so you don't have to add any sugar. So I'm going to add these tomatoes, and you might be thinking, well, Bryant, you're such an advocate of fresh local food. Why are you using canned tomatoes? And I will say that I discourage people from eating a lot. Most canned foods, but tomatoes are the one of probably a couple of exceptions. And let me tell you why. If you get a good organic tomato brand, Muir Glen is my favorite. Their quality, they actually produce a good, canned tomatoes, diced whole sauces. Here's the thing. With this brand and other good quality canned tomato brands, they harvest the tomatoes right at their peak, and then they go and process them and put them in cans, and then they get them to the store. So often, the tomatoes, when I think about going to visit my parents and the Publix, I think it's the supermarket where they live in Huntsville, Alabama. And they're fresh tomatoes, but these tomatoes have been shipped from California. So they're sitting on refrigerated trucks for weeks. Then they get to the market. And by the time they're sitting there, and the thing is, the way that they can even make it across country at these big corporate supermarkets is that they have to harvest them before they're fully ripe. And so you're getting this tomato that often tastes like cardboard. So, these canned tomatoes are fine for kind of yielding when you're adding it to a dish, because it's going to be like really flavorful. So we add our little stock in here. I realized that I left my peanut butter in the kitchen. I could go run and get it, but I'm just going to talk you through this. The peanut butter is to add more depth. Peanuts are used throughout West and Central African cooking in many dishes. And what it does is it adds more depth and more flavor and creaminess to this particular curry. So if you have a tree nut allergy, obviously peanuts are not going to work. You can substitute most nuts for this to give it that same kind of like feel of creaminess and depth of flavor. You can use cashew butter, you can use hazelnut, you can use almond butter for that matter. So don't get stuck on the peanut butter. Like I said, the recipe should be used as a guide. Mix and match, figure out what works for you. If this recipe calls for mustard greens, and we have a 100 square foot raised bed in our front yard that's full of mustard greens because they seeded from last season and we just got many more than we expected. But say you don't have mustard greens at home. Say you have Swiss chard. Use the Swiss chard instead. Be creative. Use what's on hand. That's where the magic lays.
Right.
Once you have this, yep.
There's another question from the audience that is really interesting too. What are you cooking on? Is that a grill, a gas stove, or what's that piece of your equipment?
Great question. This is a portable induction burner. And these are often used in cooking schools or, people who are doing cooking demonstration because it allows you to move it around. Because it's an induction burner, there isn't an open flame, so it's safe. Most institutions, when I do cooking demonstrations, they don't allow open flames, so we can use an induction burner instead. The key is, if you're using an induction burner, most of them rely upon either a stainless steel skillet, pot, or whatever, or it has to be cast iron. Otherwise, it won't work. So if it's aluminum or something like that, it's just not going to connect and it won't work. But here's the deal. Because my work is rooted in food justice activism, I've traveled the country, and whenever I go on book tours, before I had kids, whenever I would travel and, promote my book, I always made it a point to connect with local food justice organizations that are addressing, the most impacted communities across the country. And so there was one organization in the Detroit area called Our Kitchen Table, and they do a lot of work with low-income people in Michigan, helping bring more food security. And induction burners was one of the things that I know many of their clients, they would give them to them because people were living in SROs, people were living in situations where they didn't have a full kitchen. So I'm simply saying that if you're a student, if you are housing insecure, or just in a situation where you may not have access to a full-on beautiful kitchen, these are great. And they're like, you can do everything you do on a stove, you can do with this. So I highly recommend them if they make sense for your life situation.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm pretty much done with this because once we add our nut butter, we have this really flavorful base that I probably simmer for about 20 to 30 minutes just to allow the flavors to condense and everything to marinate. And you can use this for whatever. Like in the recipe, it calls for mustard greens, whatever seasonal vegetables you might have on hand, they would work well in here. And so another tip that I want to use, and I often tell people who are busy, parents, students, if you can double the quantity of the recipes that you make and freeze that extra batch, then that will allow you to have some for later, so you don't have to go through the whole process and cooking it in. So making that base, you can add whatever you want to it, and it's going to be 100. So,
well, Bryant, then let me ask you another question from the audience, and then I have a couple of my own that I'm curious about.
Okay.
When you roast your vegetables for your stock, do you use a dry roast or do you use a high temperature oil? Is a question that's come up.
That's a great question. Typically, I will toss them in a little bit of fat, probably a tablespoon at most of olive oil, add a little salt, spread them on a pan, and I roast them in the oven. So I'll do high heat, 425, roast them for about 50 minutes. That's going to start to, once again, caramelize the vegetables, bring out that natural sugar, and then you just follow the rest of the steps of the stock that I described, adding it to a pot, 2 quarts of water, bring it up to a boil, let it simmer, and then that's going to yield, the stock will be sweeter, but it's also just going to be more heavier and dense, and something that I think is very fitting for the winter months. In the summer months, I'm all about just clean, basic stocks and going from there.
So I have some questions like, what's one of the most important meals that you've had to make in your lifetime in terms of an important event or an important guest? What's that been like as a chef or a cook?
That is a great question. And I don't even have to think about that. I would say the highlight of my career as a creative person working in the food world was when Angela Davis's partner invited me to make Angela Davis's dinner for her 75th birthday. And so I had the opportunity of putting together a team of people that I love working with. We, you know, we had the food team, we had the mixology team, there was music. We made an amazing meal, and we got to celebrate and give flowers to one of our heroines while they're still here. So that's for me, hands down, best highlight of my career.
Yes. I know that you talk a lot too, Bryant, about this connection between food and music, and that even in some of your books, there's playlists and you make that connection explicit. Can you speak a little bit on that, please?
You know, I grew up in a musical family. My paternal grandfather, no, my maternal grandfather, Edward, he had a traveling gospel quartet in the 1950s, and they traveled throughout the South. They were the first group to play on the radio in Memphis, and because of that, all his children were very musical. From my mother, who sings in the choir, to my uncle Don, who was a really well-known singer and songwriter in the 1970s for this record label in Memphis, High Records. Willie Mitchell, Ann Peebles, Al Green were all on that label, and my uncle wrote hits for these folks. And he married Ann Peebles, who's my aunt. She has this big hit, I Can't Stand the Rain Against My Window. And so whenever we had family gatherings, music was present. It's just inseparable. If we had like family gatherings, people were cooking food, we had a big spread, and my mom and her siblings were singing and playing the piano, and just it all seamlessly blended together. And so for me, they're just inseparable. And I use the playlist as an opportunity to tell a different story. I mean, so Vegetable Kingdom, my latest book, one of the things that I didn't do until this one is I actually have the full playlist at the beginning of the book. Usually I have just the songs with each recipe, but this one has a full playlist of the book, and you can actually go to Spotify and you can look up Vegetable Kingdom and you'll find the playlist. But there's this subtext and there's like a whole story that I tell with the music as well. And in this book, it's just songs, but in prior books, I also recommend films, I recommend books, I recommend from scholarly monographs to poetry books. And so I'm just always like, I find more inspiration for my food work outside of the food world. I'm talking about going to fine art museums, walking around, looking at street art, listening to music. And so I just see these all as fodder. And it's just about living life and enjoying life. And I'm really encouraging you to do the same. And that's eating good food, spending time with family, listening to good music, and just enjoying yourself. So.
Yes. So, I've been a fan of yours for quite some time, Bryant, and I've seen the work kind of big up and spread out and go deeper. I wonder, as you've, followed this path, how has your understanding of success shifted, evolved over time?
That's a great question, Dr. Vaughn. And I would say that, I didn't get into the work to publish books or to be on television or to be this public figure. When I first started working around these issues, it was because I really, when I thought back at like many of the social movements in the 20th century, from the civil rights movement in the American South to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, it was young people, their bravery, their brilliance, their ingenuity that helped push these movements forward. So from the beginning, when I started thinking about this food justice movement, this movement to create a more healthful and just and sustainable food system that ensures that everyone, regardless of skin color or zip code or income, had the ability to access good food. I knew that young people we needed to train a cadre of young people who would be using their brilliance and their talent and their energy and their ingenuity to push this movement forward. And so because of that, my measure of success was impacting one person. And I truly felt like if I impacted one person in the way that KRS-One impacted me, in the way that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's books and Dick Gregory and family members and all these people who, have helped me become who I am, if I can do that for one person, then that's success for me. As my career has unfolded, it's shifted a little bit. And now I think, the success is, sorry. I had to let my wife in. Sorry about that. But success to me now is about leveraging my platform, leveraging my social capital, and helping other people to, come up. Because I had the pleasure and the privilege of being mentored by, my first book, Grub, which came out in 2006, was written with this woman, Anna LaPay, a friend and colleague. Her mother, Frances Moore LaPay, wrote this seminal book in the 1970s, Diet for a Small Planet, which pushed back against these notions that, we don't have enough food to feed everyone on the planet, and it showed that we actually do. It's just about how the food is being distributed and used. And so, I had the privilege of having this OG mentor me and help me understand how to be an author and a public figure. And so now I'm all about initiatives that help support the next generation of food creatives and give them an opportunity to build their own or do whatever they want to do, whether it's grassroots activism, whether it's writing books, whether it's being a media personality. I really want to use my 2 decades of experience to support others.
Ashe. So now that the sauce is ready, people just take their greens and pour that over it, or what do we do?
Yes, so we're gonna just imagine, I turned this off because the induction burner can be a little loud. So let's just imagine that that's been simmering for about 20 minutes. I would it depends on how you want to play it. I like to have my greens. A lot of people talk about the way in which many African Americans will cook greens to death until they're no longer green, but they're like brown. But what the elders would tell you is when you cook greens like that, you have to drink the pot liquor. That's the thing. Whatever liquid is left over, you drink that, and a lot of the nutrients that leach out from the leafy greens, you get those. And so for a dish like this, it's just going to be simmering. I'll put greens in there and let those simmer for 2 hours, and they're just going to be meltingly tender and delicious. If you want to have just a little more al dente feel and not so cooked to death, you can certainly just put those in and let them boil or simmer for the last 10 minutes. And then, they're going to be good to go. I think it should be said, because I don't know if everyone's attuned to this, but if I'm making a soup or a stew, if I'm able to plan ahead, what I often do is make it the night before I'm serving it. Because I think, as many of you know, oftentimes leftovers or, whatever you made, the day after, it's so much more flavorful because those flavors have gotten a chance to concentrate overnight, and it just really opens it up. So I suggest you do that with this if you're going to make it. And like I said, you have leftovers for a couple of days, assuming you don't eat it all in one sitting.
Absolutely. Well, it's been wonderful to have you here, Bryant. Do you have any advice for students who are, interested in finding a career path as unique and suited to them as yours is for you? Or any, advice about overcoming obstacles, thinking out of the box? Any kind of offering like that for us would be well appreciated.
Yeah, I will say, listen to your heart, listen to your spirit. When I decided to leave graduate school and leave with my master's and not finish this PhD program as I had imagined I would, and as my family imagined I would. And I understand the reason that Black parents are like this. Overachieving Black families often have a very limited kind of way in which we imagine success. And I say my parents were similar in that it was always, doctor, lawyer, engineer. I don't even think professor was in there, but I just kind of snuck that in and felt like I would do that. But, my parents didn't get it. In their mind, understanding the history of African Americans and the ways in which so many African Americans were relegated to service positions and working in the houses of whites in the kitchen, it in my parents' mind, it was like I'm going backwards. They just didn't get the vision. They're like, well, what are you doing? Like you're doing a PhD, then you're going to culinary school. You're entering a field in which we've been trying to like move away from and be more in these, white collar professional positions. And so it took a while for them to get the vision and understand, the way in which I saw food as a vehicle for impacting the world and changing like people, the way that people relate to food, changing public health, improving the environmental health. And so I want to encourage people, like, if you have a passion, here's the thing, if 2020 didn't teach us anything, it certainly taught us that our visions of stability, there is no stability. What careers we might imagine are like the careers that are like whatever, like lucrative or just desired. They may not be there for 10 years from now. And so I just think that, I want to say that I understand when people have like economic circumstances that require them to make money to take care of not just themselves, but family members. And there's no judgment because I understand that people need to do what they need to do. But I just want to encourage people to find your own passion, find what drives you and enlivens you, and define success for yourself. So often we let the wider culture, our parents, our family members, our community kind of drive how we imagine success. And most often it's coming from a good place. It's because people want us to be stable and they want us, they want to feel like you're going to be okay. But I want to say, you got to be okay with yourself. You got to do something that you feel like you can live with, that you can look at yourself in the morning every day and feel like I'm good with myself and I'm good with what I'm doing in the world. And so I just want to encourage you to figure out how you can do that.
Ashe. So before I close this out, Bryant, can you show us that good food in that pot so we can see what that finished product look like up close in that side camera?
It's not what it's going to be just because I was kind of like talking you through it and cheating.
Okay.
But, I will say, if I left that on and this simmered for maybe 20 minutes or half an hour,
Okay.
it's actually going to start to reduce and concentrate the flavors. And then it's going to be a little thicker. And obviously it's one of those things that, it's about like your own taste. Some people like curries that are super thick and have that kind of viscous feel, and other people like them a little looser. And, you can always add water or stock to your liking just to loosen it up a little bit. But, it's going to be delicious. I will say that.
Yes, sir. Well, Bryant Terry, thank you so much for joining us here at CBSS. Your presence has been a blessing. Those of us who cooked along with you are about to enjoy some delicious food. I know I'm going to try the recipe out later on this week. And, you are appreciated, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Once again, I wish nothing but success for the center. And as soon as we can safely do so, I would love to come and do something in person and just, say hi to the community.
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Special shout out to all the CBSS family, wherever you are joining our broadcast. I want to thank the CBSS action team that helped put this together. I want to thank our producer, Sonia Pina. I want to invite people to support our center with your donations. You can help us keep doing this important work to support Black students here at CSU Monterey Bay. And I want to invite you to join us next week, Thursday, at 6 p.m. in a conversation with visual artist Isu Orundide. It's going to be a special time, more Black history, more fun. Please join us. Have a great evening. Thank you.